As we move into 2026, manipulation has not become louder. It has become quieter, smoother, and far more convincing. The most dangerous forms of control no longer arrive through threats or raised voices. They arrive through calm questions, concerned tones, and reasonable words that slowly pull you off your own center. You are not attacked. You are invited to explain yourself. And the moment you feel that urge to justify a choice that was already yours to make, something subtle has begun to shift. Not because you are weak, but because you are human. This happens more often than most people want to admit. At work, when a discussion quietly turns until you are defending a decision you already made. In families, when care slowly becomes pressure and concern quietly becomes control. In close relationships, when you leave a conversation feeling confused, smaller, or strangely guilty, even though nothing openly cruel was said. These moments rarely feel dramatic. That is why they are effective. They feel familiar. They feel normal. And because they feel normal, they bypass your defenses. Stoicism never taught people how to win arguments. It taught them how to remain sovereign. The Stoics understood that power rarely comes from force. It comes from emotional leverage, from guilt, from urgency, from subtly rewriting the story until you begin to doubt your own footing. Once your inner steadiness is disturbed, clarity is the first thing to disappear. And when clarity goes, you become easier to steer. Most people believe manipulation looks like domination. In reality, it often looks like conversation. The manipulator does not need to prove you wrong. They only need you to start proving yourself. Every explanation becomes material. Every justification becomes leverage. Each time you add another sentence, you move one step further away from your own authority. Over time, this creates a quiet exhaustion. You begin rehearsing conversations in advance. You anticipate resistance even before you speak. Decisions that should feel simple start to feel heavy. This is not because you lack intelligence or strength. It is because you have been trained, slowly, to hand your power away through reaction. Stoicism offers a different path, not silence as avoidance, but silence as choice, not aggression, but restraint, not domination, but self-command. The Stoics believed that your peace does not depend on controlling other people. It depends on controlling what you permit inside yourself. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that other people's actions belong to them, but your judgments belong to you. Epictetus was even more direct. If you cannot govern your own responses, someone else eventually will. This is why Stoic responses are not clever comebacks. They are boundaries spoken calmly. They are ways of closing doors without slamming them, ways of staying present without surrendering yourself. They are not designed to embarrass, intimidate, or silence anyone. They are designed to quiet the impulse to give your power away. That impulse is the real vulnerability. In this series, you are not going to learn how to overpower difficult people. You are going to learn how to remain steady when they try to pull you off balance. You will hear 10 Stoic phrases, but more importantly, you will understand the psychology behind them, when to use them, why they work, and how to carry yourself so they land without sounding defensive or cold. Each phrase is simple. The strength comes from restraint, not performance. There is something important to understand before we go any further. These phrases are not meant to be used all at once. They are not scripts to memorize or weapons to deploy. They are reflections of an inner posture. When your inner world is ordered, your words become fewer and more precise. You stop negotiating your boundaries. You stop explaining what does not need to be explained. You stop reacting just to relieve tension. And when that happens, manipulation loses its fuel. The goal here is not to make other people regret their behavior. Stoicism is not revenge disguised as calm. The goal is freedom. Freedom from being pulled into chaos by tone, implication, or pressure. Freedom from conversations that leave you doubting yourself. Freedom from the exhausting habit of managing other people's emotions at the expense of your own clarity. When you reclaim that freedom, Something changes quietly, but decisively. You begin to move through the world with a different kind of authority, not loud, not intimidating, unstealable. As you listen to what follows, notice which phrases feel uncomfortable, not the ones that sound impressive, but the ones that feel hardest to say. That discomfort usually marks the place where you have been giving ground for a long time. Growth does not begin with confrontation, it begins with awareness. And awareness begins the moment you realize that calm is not weakness. Calm is control returned to its rightful owner. In the next part, we begin with the first Stoic boundary, a phrase that ends explanation without hostility and closes the most common door manipulation walks through. There is a precise moment when a conversation quietly turns against you, even though nothing aggressive has been said. You begin with clarity. You know what you want to do. The decision feels settled inside you. Then the questions arrive. They sound reasonable, thoughtful, even supportive. Have you really considered every angle? Why are you so certain? Wouldn't it be safer to wait a little longer? None of these questions are hostile on their own, and that is exactly why they work. Before you notice what is happening, you are no longer deciding, you are explaining. And the more you explain, the more unsteady you feel, as if your footing is being slowly negotiated away. This is the most common mechanism manipulation relies on. It does not need force, it only needs an opening. Explanation creates that opening. Each additional sentence hands the other person material to work with. They are not listening to understand, they are listening to find the next lever. At work, this often looks like a colleague who keeps circling back to a decision you already made, framing their persistence as diligence or collaboration. In families, it appears as concern that quietly turns into debate, then into pressure. Tomorrow there is another conversation, then another. The door is never allowed to close. The cost of falling into this pattern is not immediate conflict, it is erosion. Over time, you begin to associate decision-making with tension. You start rehearsing defenses in advance. You hesitate before choosing because you anticipate having to justify yourself afterward. What should feel clean and direct becomes heavy and complicated. Self-trust weakens, not all at once, but gradually. You begin living one step removed from your own authority, always preparing to explain instead of simply standing. Stoicism addresses this pattern at its root. The Stoics believed that judgment is one of the few things that truly belongs to you. Once exercised with reason, it does not require ongoing defense. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that if something is right, it does not need applause, and if it is wrong, no explanation will make it right. This is where the first Stoic phrase becomes powerful, not because it is clever, but because it is restrained. I understand what you're saying, and I've already decided. The first half removes unnecessary friction. You are not dismissive, you are not reactive, you acknowledge the other person without giving ground. The second half closes the opening cleanly. You do not argue, you do not justify, you do not invite further discussion. The sentence ends where it needs to end. What matters most here is how this phrase is delivered. There is no edge in your voice, no impatience, no need to sound firm or authoritative. Calm is enough. The temptation to add more words will appear almost immediately. You may feel the urge to clarify your reasoning, to reassure them that you are still open-minded, still reasonable, still fair. That urge is the old pattern trying to survive. Each extra explanation reopens the door you just closed. Stoicism teaches restraint at this exact point. Calm repetition is sufficient. If the pressure returns tomorrow, the phrase remains the same. You do not escalate. You do not defend. You remain where you are. Like a rock against waves, you do not chase them. You let them pass. Understanding is not agreement. Listening is not permission. You do not owe anyone access to your inner process. When you stop over-explaining, something subtle but important changes inside you. Decisions begin to feel lighter again. You notice how much energy you once spent managing other people's reactions instead of trusting your own judgment. Conversations shorten, tension dissolves faster. You stop negotiating with yourself after the conversation ends. This phrase is not about shutting people out. It is about protecting the space where your clarity lives. There is also an important psychological shift that occurs on the other side of this boundary. People quickly learn whether persistence grants them influence. When it does not, the behavior often fades. Some will respect the boundary immediately. Others may test it once or twice more. Either way, you gain clarity without conflict. You learn who is interested in understanding and who is interested in control. That information alone is valuable. The Stoics did not believe in endless dialogue. They believed in alignment. Once you are aligned internally, your words become fewer and more precise. You stop explaining what does not need to be explained. You stop reacting just to relieve tension. And when that happens, manipulation loses its easiest point of entry. This first phrase sets the foundation for everything that follows. It teaches you to end explanation without hostility and to close doors without slamming them. When you can do this consistently, you reclaim something essential. Your life begins to move forward, not when others are convinced, but when you are aligned with your own judgment. In the next part, we move to a boundary designed for a different kind of pressure, when opinions are presented as facts and disagreement is treated as a flaw rather than a right. There is a different kind of pressure that does not come from persistence, but from certainty. Someone states their opinion as if it were a final verdict. The tone is calm, confident, and unquestionable. Everyone sees it this way. Any reasonable person would agree. In that moment, the conversation quietly shifts. It is no longer an exchange of perspectives. It becomes a test of compliance. If you disagree, you are not simply different. You are framed as difficult, irrational, or unaware. And without realizing it, you begin to feel the pull to soften your stance, to add disclaimers, to defend your perspective as if it were on trial. This is where many people lose themselves quietly, not because they were shouted down, but because disagreement started to feel unsafe. Harmony becomes something you maintain by shrinking. Over time, this habit trains you to replace independent judgment with borrowed certainty. You stop asking what you actually think and start asking what will be acceptable. The cost is not one lost conversation. It is the slow erosion of authorship over your own life. Stoicism offers a clean boundary here. You're entitled to your view. I'm entitled to disagree. This phrase restores balance without hostility. The first half grants freedom. You are not fighting their opinion or trying to dismantle it. The second half reclaims your own ground. Two truths are allowed to exist side by side without needing to conquer each other. There is no courtroom left to perform in. Without resistance, the pressure collapses. The Stoics were clear that opinions do not define reality unless you let them. Epictetus taught that what disturbs us is not what is said, but the judgment we attach to it. When you stop treating disagreement as a threat, your peace stabilizes. Conversations lose their heat, control attempts stall. You step out of the argument without submitting or attacking. This is not silence, it is sovereignty. When disagreement no longer threatens your identity, you stop explaining yourself into exhaustion. Closely related to this pressure is another, even more common one, the pressure to override discomfort for the sake of smoothness. There is a moment many people recognize, but rarely honor. You feel it before you can explain it. A tightening in the chest, a quiet resistance. Something inside you says, "This isn't right for me." Yet the situation keeps moving forward as if that signal does not matter. Someone minimizes your hesitation. They frame your discomfort as overthinking, sensitivity, or selfishness. And slowly, you are pushed toward overriding yourself just to keep things easy. This is one of the most reliable doors manipulation walks through. Discomfort is inconvenient for other people's plans, so it gets reframed. It's not a big deal, just this once. Anyone else would be fine with it. When you ignore that internal boundary repeatedly, you do not just agree to one request. You train yourself to doubt your own signals. Over time, that doubt becomes automatic. You stop listening inward and start scanning outward for permission. The Stoic response here is grounded and unapologetic. I'm not comfortable with this, so I won't be doing it. This sentence does not accuse. It does not debate ethics or intentions. It reports your internal state and aligns your action with it. Feeling and behavior move together. No drama, no justification, just clarity. For the Stoics, living well meant acting in accordance with reason and inner coherence, not social pressure. Marcus Aurelius wrote that if something is not right, do not do it. Discomfort, when honest, is often reason speaking quietly. When people push back after you state this boundary, notice the temptation to soften your stance, to explain further, to make them comfortable with your refusal. That is the old pattern trying to return. Calm repetition is enough. You do not need agreement for alignment. Each time you honor this boundary, something stabilizes inside you. Self-trust rebuilds. Decisions feel cleaner. You stop abandoning yourself in small ways that later feel heavy. This phrase is not about rigidity. It is about being rooted. When your actions match your inner signals, manipulation loses leverage because there is nothing left to exploit. Both of these phrases protect the same core principle. Your judgment belongs to you. Your discomfort belongs to you. When you stop treating disagreement and discomfort as problems to be solved, you stop negotiating your dignity away. Conversations become simpler. You say less, but what you say carries more weight. You begin to move through interactions without bracing yourself for impact. This stage of the Stoic path is about reclaiming authorship. You allow others their opinions without renting space inside your mind. You allow discomfort to guide your decisions instead of overriding it for approval. And in doing so, you quietly step out of patterns that once drained you. In the next part, we move deeper into boundaries that protect something even more essential than comfort or opinion. We address what happens when agreement requires self-betrayal, when tone becomes a weapon, and when staying calm means knowing when to step away. There is a deeper layer of manipulation that does not target your opinions or your comfort, but your identity. It appears when a request sounds reasonable on the surface, yet carries an unspoken condition beneath it. To keep things smooth, you will need to stay silent about something that matters to you. To remain included, you will need to tolerate behavior that quietly crosses your values. Nothing is stated directly, but the message is clear. Belonging comes at a price, and that price is self-respect. Many people say yes in these moments, not because they agree, but because they fear what saying no might change. They tell themselves it is temporary. That harmony is worth the compromise. But each time you comply at the expense of your dignity, something inside you learns a dangerous lesson. Your values are negotiable when approval is on the line. Over time, loyalty becomes confused with self-erasure. You begin measuring your worth by how well you can accommodate others, rather than by how honestly you live. Stoicism draws a hard line here, not aggressively, but clearly. If I have to disrespect myself to please you, my answer is no. This phrase does something important. It names the real cost that was previously hidden, not inconvenience, not disagreement, disrespect. And then it closes the negotiation without hostility. There is no moral lecture, no accusation, just alignment. The Stoics believed that character is shaped by the choices you make when pressure is subtle. Epictetus taught that if you want to improve, you must be willing to be misunderstood. Protecting your integrity may cost you approval, and that cost is worth paying. When you hold this line calmly, some people will push harder, others will fall silent. Either way, you stop bargaining with your conscience. You choose who you are over how you are perceived. This boundary changes your internal landscape. You stop confusing kindness with compliance. You begin to feel a steadiness that does not depend on being liked. Decisions become simpler because they are anchored in identity rather than outcome. When pleasing others no longer requires you to diminish yourself, your life grows quieter and more coherent. Respect begins internally, and everything else rearranges itself around that truth. Closely connected to this boundary is another that protects your clarity in real time, when conversations themselves become corrosive. There is a moment when dialogue stops being about the topic and starts being about dominance. Words may still sound reasonable, but tone sharpens, sarcasm appears, volume rises just enough to intimidate. Your body reacts before your mind does. You feel the familiar tension of staying present in a space that no longer supports understanding. Many people stay in these conversations because leaving feels rude or dramatic. They endure, believing that maturity means tolerance. Stoicism rejects this idea. Endurance is not virtue when it erodes your inner order. Tone is not neutral, it is information. When tone becomes hostile or coercive, clarity cannot survive. This is where the next boundary matters. I won't continue this conversation in that tone. Notice the restraint. You are not labeling the other person as wrong or malicious. You are not arguing about intent. You are naming the condition under which you are willing to engage. The Stoics understood that you choose the arena before you choose the argument. Tone is an external factor. Participation is a choice. What matters here is follow-through. If the tone softens, you stay. If it does not, you step away without explanation or spectacle. A boundary spoken without action becomes a suggestion. A boundary enacted calmly becomes reality. People learn very quickly what behavior grants them access to you. This is not about superiority, it is about selectivity. When you stop normalizing disrespect in the name of resolution, your nervous system begins to relax. Conversations no longer feel like battles you must survive. You trust yourself to step back when dignity is compromised. Over time, dialogue becomes lighter because you are no longer carrying the burden of staying at any cost. Calm stops meaning passive. Calm becomes active self-respect. These two boundaries work together. One protects your identity, the other protects your clarity. Together, they mark a turning point on the Stoic path. You stop sacrificing yourself for approval, and you stop engaging where respect is absent. You are no longer trying to manage other people's reactions. You are managing your own alignment. At this stage, something important shifts. You begin to notice how much energy was once spent maintaining access for others rather than maintaining order within yourself. That energy returns. Decisions feel cleaner. Silence feels intentional rather than tense. You move through interactions without bracing for impact because you trust your ability to leave when necessary. In the next part, we go even deeper. We explore boundaries that protect authorship over your life itself. When concern turns into control, when guilt is used as leverage, and when compassion must be balanced with responsibility. These are the moments where many people lose sovereignty without realizing it. And they are also the moments where Stoic clarity becomes most powerful. As boundaries become clearer, manipulation often changes its shape. It no longer pushes directly, it leans in with concern. Someone explains carefully why they are worried about you, your choice, your future. They outline risks. They remind you of consequences. At first, it feels caring, but as the conversation continues, something subtle shifts. Your decision is no longer being discussed. It is being negotiated. Disagreement begins to feel like betrayal. Refusal starts to sound irresponsible. This is how authority quietly slips away. Control does not arrive as a command. It arrives as advice that refuses to end. In families, it sounds like, "I just don't want you to regret this." At work, it appears as, "I'd hate for this to reflect badly on you." The pressure is not to choose wisely, but to choose in a way that keeps someone else comfortable. Over time, you begin outsourcing judgment. You hesitate. You wait for approval. You confuse responsibility with obedience. What fades is not confidence, but authorship, the sense that your life genuinely belongs to you. The Stoic boundary here restores authorship without conflict. This matters to you, but this decision is mine to make. The first half acknowledges their emotional investment. You are not dismissive. You are listening. The second half places the boundary precisely where it belongs. Concern is recognized, but authority is not surrendered. The Stoics were clear that responsibility cannot be delegated. Epictetus taught that no one is free who is not master of himself. Mastery begins with deciding and standing by it. When this boundary is stated calmly and repeated if necessary, advice loses its leverage. Some people will persist, hoping repetition will reopen the question. Calm repetition closes it again. Others will step back, recognizing that influence has limits. In both cases, you remain steady. You own your decisions, and therefore you also own their outcomes. Wins and mistakes alike become teachers rather than weapons others can use against you. Something quiet returns. The dignity of steering your own life. Closely following this pressure comes another, even more powerful one: guilt. You say no, and the emotional temperature changes. Someone sighs. Someone looks hurt. You are told they are disappointed or stressed because of what you decided. The implication is subtle but heavy. Your boundary caused their pain, and if you are not careful, you begin negotiating with your conscience just to ease someone else's feelings. This is one of the most effective tools of manipulation because it disguises itself as vulnerability. You are not accused of wrongdoing. You are made responsible for someone else's emotional state. Over time, this trains you to manage moods instead of making choices. You soften decisions. You comply to avoid fallout. Your life becomes an act of emotional weather control. The cost is clarity. Compassion turns into self-erasure. Stoicism redraws the border cleanly. I'm responsible for what I do, not for how you feel about it. This phrase holds accountability without absorbing guilt. If you act unfairly, you repair it. Stoicism never excused harm, but emotions belong to the person experiencing them. As Epictetus taught, people are disturbed not by events, but by their judgments of them. When you speak this line gently and consistently, emotional pressure loses its grip. You can care without complying. You can listen without surrendering. Guilt no longer grants control. When guilt loses its power, another pressure often appears. The pressure of discomfort. Silence stretches. The other person waits. You feel the urge to agree simply to end the tension. Nothing hostile is happening, yet something inside you tightens. You know that saying yes would be easier in the moment, even though it would leave you hollow afterward. This is how many people betray themselves quietly, not through force, but through discomfort avoidance. Forced agreement becomes a social lubricant. It keeps things smooth while slowly eroding integrity. Over time, you learn to say yes automatically, even when your inner response is no or not yet. Each false agreement leaves residue, a sense that you are living slightly out of alignment with yourself. Stoicism interrupts this pattern with clarity. I prefer honest silence to a forced agreement. This phrase names what most people fear but rarely choose. Silence here is not avoidance, it is truth. The Stoics valued inner coherence over social ease. Agreement made under pressure disarms reason. Silence preserves it. When there is no false yes to lean on, the conversation must either find honesty or pause. Manipulation thrives in gray areas. This boundary removes the gray. You leave conversations intact without regret or self-reproach. Integrity remains whole. Together, these three boundaries protect something fundamental: authority over your life, responsibility without guilt, integrity without performance. You stop managing other people's emotions. You stop trading honesty for comfort. Peace stops being something you negotiate for. It becomes something you protect. In the final part, we move to the deepest level of manipulation and the most decisive Stoic clarity. When reality itself is questioned, when forgiveness is confused with access, And when growth requires leaving quietly without explanation, this is where the Stoic path completes its arc, not loudly, but decisively. At the deepest level of manipulation, the pressure no longer targets your decisions or your emotions. It targets your sense of reality. You recall something clearly, a comment, a pattern, a moment that crossed a line. You speak about it calmly, not to accuse, but to name what happened. The response comes back, measured and confident. That's not what happened. Not angry, not loud, just certain. Slowly, the ground beneath you begins to shift. You replay the memory. You second-guess details. You wonder if you exaggerated or misunderstood. By the end of the conversation, you are no longer upset at them. You are unsure of yourself. This is how gaslighting works at its quietest. It does not require denial or shouting. It works by relocating authority over reality. Your experience is reframed as emotional. Their version is framed as reasonable. And because you value fairness, you begin conceding ground. You explain. You justify. You look for proof of what you already lived through. Over time, you stop trusting your perception and begin outsourcing it to whoever speaks with the most confidence. This is not about winning an argument. It is about who gets to narrate your life. Stoicism draws a firm boundary here. I know what I lived through. I won't doubt myself because you say otherwise. This phrase does not argue facts. It anchors you in experience. You are not claiming infallibility. You are claiming authorship. The Stoics were clear that your mind must remain sovereign. Epictetus warned that if someone provokes you, your mind has already participated. Gaslighting only succeeds when judgment is surrendered. This boundary refuses that transfer. When you hold this line calmly, without escalation, something essential returns. You stop collecting evidence for your own sanity. You stop rehearsing explanations to justify your memory. Your inner world becomes a place you can stand without trembling. Disagreement may continue. Others may scoff or accuse you of being stubborn. You do not argue. Reality does not need applause to exist. Over time, the most important defense comes back online. Trust in yourself. As clarity stabilizes, the Stoic path reaches its final test. Forgiveness. Many people reach a moment where the anger has softened. You may even feel genuine forgiveness rising, a willingness to let go of resentment for your own peace. And yet, when the idea of returning to the old closeness appears, something inside you resists, not with bitterness, but with clarity. You realize that forgiveness does not automatically mean reopening the same door. This is where many people get trapped again. They are told that if they truly forgave, things would go back to how they were. That distance means punishment. That boundaries mean coldness. But Stoicism makes a critical distinction. Forgiveness heals the wound. Access determines whether it is reopened. When this distinction is ignored, patterns repeat. The same behaviors return. Peace never lasts because proximity was never adjusted. The final Stoic boundary restores wisdom to compassion. I can forgive you, but you no longer get the same access to my life. Forgiveness releases the emotional burden. You are not carrying resentment forward. The second half acknowledges reality. Trust, closeness, and influence are shaped by behavior, not granted automatically. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Forgiving without restoring access is not punishment. It is discernment. When you live this boundary, something changes quietly but permanently. You stop arguing about the past. You stop justifying distance. Your actions speak without explanation. Some people will accuse you of changing. They are right. You have. You forgive fully and choose carefully. Peace becomes protected by clarity rather than guarded by resentment. This is where the Stoic path completes its arc. Not with confrontation, not with a final speech, but with a quiet departure from cycles that no longer require your participation. None of these phrases were designed to silence other people. They were designed to silence the impulse inside you that once felt compelled to explain, justify, or shrink just to keep the peace. Manipulation loses its power the moment you stop feeding it with reactions. What replaces that habit is not coldness or isolation, it is clarity. Stoicism never promised an easier social life. It promised a steadier, inner one. When you stop managing other people's emotions, stop arguing with distorted narratives, and stop trading dignity for approval, something irreversible happens. You begin to feel at home inside your own decisions. Conversations become simpler, boundaries become cleaner. Peace stops being something you chase. It becomes something you protect. Some people will respect this shift. Others will drift away. Let them. Not everyone is meant to have the same access to your time, your energy, or your inner world. The Stoic path is not about building walls. It is about choosing gates and keeping your hand on the latch. You do not need to announce your growth. You live it. You do not need to justify your distance. You embody it. If there is one thing to carry forward, let it be this. Calm is not weakness. Calm is unstealable power. When your inner world is ordered, your life speaks quietly on your behalf. That is the end of the cycle, and the beginning of a steadier way of living.